A police officer is on a quiet patrol when a frantic horse gallops straight toward him, eyes wild with desperation. At first, he thinks the animal is just lost, until he notices something shocking on its collar. The moment he reads the message, his heart stops and his instincts kick in. Within seconds, he locks down the entire street, because what's written on that collar is more terrifying than he ever imagined. Who sent this horse for help? And what horrifying secret is waiting just beyond the trees? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The autumn wind whistled through the nearly empty streets as Officer Daniel Reed guided his patrol car along the familiar suburban route. Streetlights cast long shadows across well-manicured lawns, their orange glow barely reaching the darker corners of the neighborhood. Daniel adjusted the heat in his car, grateful for the warmth that kept the late-night chill at bay. The radio crackled with routine updates, mostly quiet tonight, just the way he liked it. After 15 years on the force, he'd learned to appreciate these peaceful moments. His headlights swept across empty driveways and darkened windows as he made his way down Cedar Lane. The steady hum of his engine was suddenly interrupted by the sharp clatter of hooves against asphalt. Daniel's trained eyes caught the movement before his brain fully processed what he was seeing. A massive chestnut horse charging straight toward his patrol car, its coat slick with mud and its eyes wide with panic. Daniel hit the brakes, his heart jumping into his throat. The horse skidded to a stop mere inches from his hood, its sides heaving and nostrils flaring. Steam rose from its trembling body in the cool night air. "Easy there," Daniel muttered, mostly to himself, as he carefully opened his car door. The dome light illuminated his badge, catching a glint of metal on the horse's collar. Something wasn't right. His instincts, honed from years of service, were screaming at him. As he approached, speaking in low, soothing tones, the horse pawed at the ground, but didn't bolt. Up close, Daniel's stomach turned at what he saw. Dark, rusty stains matted into the animal's mane and collar. Blood. Fresh blood. His fingers found something tucked into the collar's loop, a crumpled piece of paper, its edges damp with sweat or dew. Daniel pulled out his flashlight, his hand steady despite the adrenaline now coursing through his system. The message was barely legible, written in hurried strokes. Help. Trapped. 54 Willow Street. Daniel reached for his radio without hesitation. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reed. I need immediate backup at my location. Possible kidnapping situation." He rattled off his coordinates and requested a lockdown of the surrounding area, his mind already mapping out possible scenarios and escape routes. As red and blue lights began to flash in the distance, Daniel grabbed the horse's reins. The animal seemed to understand, immediately turning and starting to move. Its powerful muscles bunched and released as it broke into a gallop, glancing back periodically as if checking that Daniel was following. Heart pounding, Daniel kept pace, letting the horse guide him through the maze of suburban streets. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, but his focus remained on the desperate animal leading him toward whatever or whoever awaited at 54 Willow Street. Hours earlier, the musty air of the old shed pressed in around Clare Weston as she huddled against its rough wooden wall. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the weathered boards, casting eerie shadows across the dirt floor. Each breath sent a sharp pain through her ribs where the men had struck her, and the ropes around her wrists felt like fire against her skin. Her heart raced as she recalled the conversation she'd overheard through the thin walls. "We'll deal with her at dawn," one of them had growled. "Price wants this wrapped up clean." The name sent a chill down her spine. Warren Price, the man who'd framed her father and destroyed their family. Outside, The familiar sound of Rusty's movements caught her attention. Her faithful horse was still there, probably tied to the old hitching post. Clare could picture him clearly. His warm chestnut coat, the white star on his forehead, those intelligent eyes that had always seemed to understand her every mood. A splinter from the rotting floorboard caught her eye. Hope fluttered in her chest as she stretched her bound hands toward it, fingers trembling. The wood was sharp enough. It had to be. Gritting her teeth against the pain, Clare worked the splinter between the rope fibers. Each movement sent waves of agony through her bruised shoulders. But she kept going, ignoring the warm trickle of blood running down her wrists. Minutes felt like hours as she sawed through the thick rope. Finally, the bindings fell away. Clare bit back a cry as circulation rushed back into her hands, the sensation like thousands of needles pricking her skin. She couldn't waste time letting the pain pass. Her fingers found an old feed sack in the corner. Tearing off a small piece, she touched the cut on her forehead. Blood coated her fingertips. It would have to do for ink. With shaking hands, she pressed the paper against the moonlit floor and wrote her desperate message. Help. Trapped. 54 Willow Street. Clare crept to the shed door, her legs weak and unsteady. Rusty stood exactly where she thought, his ears perking forward at her approach. His warm breath ghosted across her face as she slipped the note into his collar, securing it carefully. "Find someone, boy," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please." She stroked his strong neck one last time, drawing comfort from his solid presence. Rusty responded with a soft whinny, pressing his velvet muzzle against her cheek before turning away. Clare watched as her most trusted friend disappeared into the darkness, taking her only hope of rescue with him. The night swallowed his form, leaving her alone with nothing but desperate prayers that help would arrive before dawn. Daniel followed Rusty's lead through the maze of the city's forgotten places. The horse moved with determined strides, his hooves clattering against broken asphalt as they wound through narrow alleyways. Chain-link fences lined their path, their rusted metal glinting dully in the moonlight. Empty lots stretched out like dark wounds in the urban landscape, filled with nothing but weeds and forgotten dreams. The night air grew heavier as they pressed on, carrying the musty scent of decay and abandonment. Rusty never hesitated, even when the path narrowed between towering stacks of discarded pallets and weather-worn crates. His ears remained forward, focused, as if hearing a call that Daniel couldn't detect. Finally, they emerged onto Willow Street. There, looming against the star-scattered sky, stood a Victorian-style house that time had forgotten, its paint peeled in long strips like bark from a dying tree. Wooden boards sealed the windows like bandages over dark wounds, and the porch sagged beneath the weight of years of neglect. Daniel's flashlight beam caught movement in the overgrown backyard. Rusty had already circled around, heading straight for a small shed. The structure looked ready to collapse, its weathered boards barely holding together. A weak light seeped through the cracks, barely visible against the darkness. Rusty reached the shed first, his powerful body throwing itself against the door. The whole structure shuddered. The horse's hooves struck the ground with desperate intensity, demanding attention. Then Daniel heard it, a weak knocking from within, followed by a voice that made his heart race. "Please, help me." The sound galvanized him into action. The rusted padlock stood no chance against his boot, breaking away with a sharp crack. Daniel yanked the door open, his flashlight beam cutting through the musty darkness inside. Clare Weston lay crumpled against the far wall, her face ghostly pale in the harsh light. Dried blood matted her hair, and angry red marks circled her wrists where ropes had bit into her flesh. Her eyes, though clouded with pain, sparked with recognition as Rusty pushed his way inside. A choked sob escaped her as she reached for her horse, her fingers tangling in his mane. Tears cut clean trails through the dirt on her face. "You did it," she whispered, pressing her forehead against Rusty's neck. Daniel moved forward, ready to assess her injuries, when a sound from the main house stopped him in his tracks. His blood ran cold as a beam of light swept across one of the upstairs windows, cutting through gaps in the boards. The kidnappers were still here. Daniel pressed himself against the shed's rough wooden wall, his trained eyes scanning the darkened silhouette of the main house. Years of police work had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every nerve in his body screamed that this situation was far from over. He reached for his radio, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. "Dispatch Officer Reed. Suspects possibly still on site. Entering house for reconnaissance." The static crackle of confirmation came through as he turned to Clare. "Stay here with Rusty. Don't move until I give the all clear." Moving like a shadow, Daniel crossed the overgrown yard. His footsteps were silent against the dew-dampened grass as he approached the house. The porch boards, despite their age, barely creaked under his careful weight. The front door protested with a low groan as he eased it open, his service weapon held ready. The interior hit him with a wall of stale air, a mixture of rotting wood, mildew, and the sharp tang of cigarette smoke that clung to the peeling wallpaper. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a living room frozen in time. A wooden table dominated the space, its surface covered in papers that seemed out of place in the abandoned house. Daniel moved closer, his breath catching as the beam illuminated their contents. Maps marked with red circles, long-range photos showing someone being followed. Then his heart skipped. Claire's face stared back at him from several snapshots, some taken just days ago. Scrawled notes filled the margins of the papers, the handwriting harsh and demanding. "She still hasn't given it up." Another note made his blood run cold. "Break her. If she dies, we search the property." Daniel's pulse quickened. This wasn't a random kidnapping. They were hunting for something specific, something they thought Clare knew about. A floorboard creaked behind him. Before Daniel could fully turn, a shadow detached itself from the hallway. Moonlight glinted off a metal pipe as a masked figure swung it toward his head. The sound of splintering wood exploded through the room. Rusty crashed through the doorway, his massive form filling the space, hooves thundering against the wooden floor. The masked man stumbled backward, startled by the sudden chaos. That split second was all Daniel needed. He tackled the assailant, using the man's own momentum to drive him to the ground. The pipe clattered away as Daniel quickly gained control, pressing his knee into the man's back. "Officer Reed to dispatch," he called into his radio, keeping the struggling man pinned. "Suspect in custody." The welcome sound of approaching sirens filled the air, growing louder by the second. As Daniel secured the handcuffs around the man's wrists, one thought kept nagging at him. What were these men so desperate to find? The night air filled with the rhythmic pulse of red and blue emergency lights, casting eerie shadows across the unkempt yard of 54 Willow Street. Officers moved purposefully through the scene, securing evidence and documenting everything. In the midst of this controlled chaos, Claire sat on the edge of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over her shoulders. Her fingers remained tangled in Rusty's mane, drawing comfort from his solid presence beside her. Daniel watched as a paramedic finished cleaning the cut on Claire's forehead. Despite her ordeal, she maintained a quiet strength that impressed him. Once the medic stepped away, Daniel knelt beside her, keeping his voice gentle but direct. "Claire, I need to understand what happened here. Why were they after you? What do they want?" She closed her eyes for a moment, her grip tightening on Rusty's mane. The horse nickered softly, as if encouraging her to speak. When she opened her eyes again, they were filled with a mix of pain and resignation. "They think I know where my father's stolen money is hidden," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But they're wrong." Claire took a shaky breath before continuing. "My father, Nathan Weston, he was one of the best racehorse trainers in the country. 20 years ago, there was a championship race. The prize money went missing overnight. Everyone blamed him." Her voice cracked slightly. "They said he stole it, that he must have hidden it somewhere before they arrested him." Daniel watched as she absently stroked Rusty's neck, gathering her thoughts. "But the thing is, Officer Reed, I don't know where the money is because there's nothing to find. My father was innocent. Someone set him up, but nobody would listen." Before Daniel could respond, a shout cut through the night air. "We got something!" One of the officers called from the house's back entrance, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Daniel rushed over, his stomach tightening as he saw what the officer had discovered. A second set of fresh footprints led away from the back door, disappearing into the overgrown field behind the property. The tracks told a clear story. While they'd caught one suspect, another had slipped away into the night. Worse still, this wasn't just about a failed kidnapping anymore. Now their second suspect knew the police were involved, and he was still out there somewhere. The police station buzzed with activity as officers coordinated their efforts to locate the second suspect. Daniel stood at his desk studying the grainy body cam footage that had captured the man's face during the chaos at Willow Street. The image wasn't perfect, but it was enough for identification. "We'll find him," Daniel assured Clare, who sat nearby with Rusty's reins wrapped tightly around her hands. The horse stood vigilant beside her, his ears twitching at every sound. Clare shook her head, her face pale in the harsh fluorescent lighting. "They won't stop," she whispered, her knuckles white against the leather reins. "They're convinced I know something." Daniel studied her face, noting the fear in her eyes. He'd seen that look before, the haunted expression of someone who knew they were being hunted. After 15 years on the force, he'd learned not to dismiss such fears. If someone was desperate enough to kidnap Clare, they wouldn't give up easily. As the first rays of sunlight began to streak across the sky, Clare stood up abruptly. "I need to go home," she announced, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "I won't leave Rusty behind." Daniel nodded, knowing better than to argue. "I'll follow you in my patrol car." The drive to Clare's ranch was tense, with Daniel keeping a careful eye on his rearview mirror. The small horse ranch appeared peaceful in the early morning light, but something felt off as they pulled into the gravel driveway. Daniel's instincts, honed by years of police work, prickled with warning. He scanned the property, noting details that others might miss. The barn door stood slightly ajar, though Clare always insisted on securing it properly. Near the fence line, fresh footprints marked the morning dew. Prints that shouldn't be there. Someone had been here, recently. "Clare," Daniel said quietly, his hand moving to his holster, "I need you to go inside and lock all the doors. Now." She must have heard the urgency in his voice because she didn't argue. Once she was safely inside, Daniel began methodically checking the property. The morning air was still, making it easier to detect any unusual sounds. He moved carefully, staying close to the buildings for cover. The barn's interior revealed more signs of intrusion. Hay scattered in unusual patterns. A saddle knocked slightly askew. Then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a branch snapping in the distance. The noise came from the tree line beyond the paddock. Daniel pressed himself against the barn wall, his hand hovering over his holster. The hunter was still here, watching, waiting. And now, he knew Daniel was watching too. Daniel moved cautiously around the barn's perimeter, his trained eyes scanning the open field ahead. Every muscle in his body was taut with anticipation. Rusty stood near the fence, his powerful frame rigid and alert, ears swiveling like radar dishes tracking invisible signals. The morning air felt thick with tension. Even the usual chorus of early birds had fallen silent, as if nature itself sensed the danger lurking in the shadows. A sharp whistle cut through the stillness like a knife. Rusty's head snapped up, his ears pricking forward. Before Daniel could reach him, the horse lunged forward, hooves thundering against the ground as he charged toward the tree line. "Rusty, no!" Claire's voice rang out behind him. She burst from the house, her feet pounding across the gravel. Daniel spun around, catching her arm. "Stay here," he ordered firmly, his grip gentle but unmovable. Without waiting for her response, he released her and sprinted after the horse. His boots kicked up clumps of wet grass as he ran. Ahead, a figure emerged from the trees, a wiry man dressed in dark clothes, reaching confidently for Rusty's reins. But he had miscalculated badly. Instead of submitting, Rusty reared up on his hind legs, massive hooves slicing through the air inches from the man's chest. The kidnapper stumbled backward, his face twisting with surprise and fear. Daniel seized his chance. He closed the distance in 3 long strides and launched himself forward, tackling the man to the ground. They rolled in the dirt, trading blows. The suspect was strong, but Daniel had years of training on his side. He landed a solid punch that sent the man's head snapping back. Sirens wailed in the distance as backup approached. Rusty circled them, his hooves striking the ground dangerously close to the fallen kidnapper. Daniel pressed his knee firmly into the man's back, securing his hands behind him. "It's over," he growled, snapping his handcuffs around the man's wrists. As other officers swarmed the scene, Daniel searched the suspect's pockets. His fingers found a crumpled piece of paper, an old yellowed newspaper clipping torn at the edges. One name stood out, circled in angry red ink: Nathan Weston. Below it, in hurried handwriting, was a chilling message. "If she doesn't know, find someone who does." Claire's relief at seeing both captors in custody was visible in her shoulders, but Daniel knew better. This was far from over. The morning sun painted long shadows across Clare's ranch, its golden light doing little to warm the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She stood outside her house, arms wrapped tightly around herself, watching the sunrise with haunted eyes. 2 men were in custody, but the victory felt hollow. Rusty grazed nearby, seemingly at peace, but Clare noticed how his ears kept swiveling, tracking every small sound. Even he sensed that the danger hadn't passed. The crunch of boots on gravel made her turn. Daniel approached, holding a worn piece of paper, the newspaper clipping they'd found. His face was etched with concern as he settled beside her on the wooden porch steps. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, though he was already seated. Clare shook her head, her eyes drawn to the article in his hands. The paper was yellow with age, its edges frayed, but the red circle around her father's name stood out stark and angry against the faded newsprint. Daniel smoothed the paper against his knee. $500,000, he said quietly. "That's what they think your father took." "He didn't take anything." Claire's voice was tired but firm. "That race-fixing scheme? It destroyed him. Someone set him up, but nobody would listen." Daniel studied the article closely. The story detailed accusations of fixed races, suspicious betting patterns, and the mysterious disappearance of nearly $500,000 in prize money. 20 years had passed, but someone clearly believed the money was still out there. "I believe you," Daniel said, surprising her. "But whoever sent these men, they don't. And if they couldn't get answers from you—" He let the thought hang in the air. Claire's face paled as understanding dawned. They might go after someone else. Daniel stood up, his decision made. His expression was grave as he turned to face her. "You're not safe here," he said firmly. "Pack a bag. You're coming with me." Claire hesitated, looking back at her home, the ranch she'd built with her own hands, her safe haven. But the memory of rope burns on her wrists was still fresh, and the desperate look in Daniel's eyes told her all she needed to know. Rusty stepped closer, pressing his warm muzzle against her shoulder in a gentle nudge. Claire reached up to stroke his neck, drawing comfort from his steady presence. "Okay," she whispered, straightening her shoulders. "Let me grab some things." The morning traffic flowed around them as Daniel's patrol car wound through the city streets. The rhythmic sway of the horse trailer behind them was oddly comforting, but it did little to ease the tension inside the vehicle. Claire sat rigid in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the yellowed newspaper clipping that seemed to mock her with its bold red circle around her father's name. The silence stretched between them until Claire couldn't bear it anymore. "You really think my father was involved in this?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He wanted to reassure her, to say that of course her father was innocent. But 20 years of police work had taught him that things were rarely that simple. The weight of his silence filled the car. At the station, Detective Susan Holt was waiting for them. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her sharp eyes missed nothing as she led them to a conference room. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, and a stack of dusty boxes sat on the table. "The Kentucky Derby scandal of 1999, Holt said, pulling out a thick file. "One of our most notorious cold cases." She spread photographs across the table, newspaper clippings, race tickets, and surveillance photos of Nathan Weston talking to various people at the track. Claire's hands trembled as she picked up a photo of her father. He looked younger, prouder, standing next to a winning horse. It was taken just days before everything fell apart. "The accusations were serious," Holt continued, her voice matter-of-fact. "Race fixing at the highest level. $500,000 in prize money vanished overnight. Your father maintained his innocence until the day he died. But the evidence—" She trailed off, shuffling through more papers. Daniel watched Claire's face carefully. "And now someone thinks the money is still out there." Holt nodded, then suddenly paused, her finger stopping on a particular page. Her expression shifted as she read something that caught her attention. "There's someone who might have answers," she said, sliding a paper across the table. The name stood out in the bold type: Henry Calloway. "He was a stable hand," Holt explained. "Worked closely with your father in those final days. But here's the problem. He disappeared 5 years ago. Just packed up and vanished without a trace." Claire stared at the name, feeling a mix of hope and dread settle in her stomach. Someone who might know the truth about her father was out there, but finding him would be another challenge entirely. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Clare's ranch as they pulled into the gravel driveway. After hours at the police station poring over old files, both Claire and Daniel felt drained, their minds swimming with more questions than answers. Rusty whinnied softly as Claire approached his stall, his familiar presence bringing her a moment of peace. She grabbed a scoop of feed and poured it into his trough, running her hand along his strong neck. The horse's warmth beneath her fingers helped ground her, pushing away the swirling thoughts about her father's past. That's when she saw him, a figure standing motionless by the fence line, partially hidden behind an old maple tree. The man was tall, his dark coat blending with the shadows of the approaching evening. "Hey!" Claire called out, her voice sharp with sudden fear. "Who's there?" The stranger turned quickly, his movements fluid and purposeful. Without a word, he melted into the woods beyond the fence. "Daniel!" Claire shouted, her heart pounding. Daniel was already moving, sprinting across the yard with the speed and precision of his police training. He vaulted over the fence and plunged into the woods, following the sound of snapping twigs and rustling leaves. The chase led him deeper into the trees, where the afternoon light barely penetrated the thick canopy. Up ahead, he caught glimpses of the man's dark coat weaving between the trunks. The stranger was fast, but Daniel was gaining ground. Finally, he cornered him behind a massive oak tree. Daniel drew his weapon, his breath steady despite the chase. "Don't move," he ordered. "Who are you?" The man slowly raised his hands, but there was something odd about his posture. He wasn't scared, he was nervous, his eyes darting between the trees, as if expecting someone else to appear. "If you want to live," the stranger said, his voice low and urgent, "stop asking questions about Nathan Weston." Before Daniel could react, the man twisted away with surprising agility. Daniel lunged forward, managing to grab the stranger's coat, but the fabric slipped through his fingers. In that brief contact, something fluttered to the ground, a folded piece of paper. By the time Daniel snatched it up, the man had vanished into the deepening shadows of the woods. Back at the ranch, Clare paced anxiously as Daniel caught his breath. He unfolded the mysterious note, revealing 3 simple words written in careful script. "Check the hollow." Clare's face drained of color as she read the message. Her hands began to shake, and she had to steady herself against the fence post, because she knew exactly what that meant. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy as Clare's truck wound its way down the narrow dirt road leading to Weston Hollow. Daniel sat in the passenger seat, scanning the tree line for any signs of movement. The air grew thick with memories as they ventured deeper into the secluded stretch of land that had been in Clare's family for generations. "My father used to bring his best horses here," Clare said softly, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "He said it was the perfect place to train them away from prying eyes." She swallowed hard. "He also made me promise never to come here alone." The truck came to a stop at the end of the old logging road. Rusty shifted restlessly in the trailer behind them, pawing at the floor. Clare's hands trembled slightly as she unhooked the trailer and let him out. The 3 of them started down an overgrown path, branches catching at their clothes. Rusty followed close behind Clare, his hooves careful on the uneven ground. His ears twitched back and forth, picking up sounds that human ears couldn't detect. After about half a mile, Clare stopped so suddenly that Daniel nearly ran into her. Her face had gone pale. "The barn," she whispered, pointing through a gap in the trees. The old training barn still stood, its weathered boards gray with age. But something wasn't right. Fresh tire tracks cut through the wet earth, the mud still soft at the edges. Broken branches and disturbed ground told a clear story. Someone had been here recently. Daniel drew his weapon and moved ahead of Clare, scanning the area for any movement. The barn door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. With practiced caution, he pushed it open wider. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the roof, illuminating dancing dust motes. The musty smell of old hay and damp wood filled their nostrils. Along one wall stood an ancient workbench, its surface thick with years of accumulated dust. But there, sitting in plain sight, was something that made Clare gasp. A rusted metal lockbox, its edges dented and scratched. Recent tool marks scarred the lid where someone had tried to force it open. "That's my father's," Clare breathed, taking a step forward. "He always kept it in his office at the track. I never knew what was inside." Clare knelt beside the rusted lockbox, her fingers hovering over its battered surface. Memories of her father flooded back, his stern warnings, the way his voice would drop to a whisper when he mentioned this box. "Some things are better left buried, Clare," he used to say, his eyes heavy with secrets. She could still picture him standing in this very barn, shoulders tense as he glanced over them like a man carrying an invisible weight. Daniel crouched next to her, examining the fresh scratches around the lock. Someone had tried to pry it open with tools, but the old metal had held firm, leaving angry silver marks against the dark rust. Rusty stood guard by the barn door, his tail swishing nervously at every creak of the old building. His ears twitched forward at the sound of distant thunder rolling across the countryside. "Let me try something," Daniel said, pulling out a well-worn multi-tool from his pocket. The leather case was smooth from years of use, telling its own story of past cases and solved mysteries. He worked at the lock with practiced movements, his face tight with concentration. After a few tense minutes, there was a sharp click that echoed through the musty air. Claire held her breath as Daniel lifted the lid. The hinges groaned in protest, releasing a musty smell of aged paper and leather that transported her straight back to her childhood. Inside, yellowed betting slips from the 1999 Kentucky Derby were stacked neatly, their edges worn soft with age. Claire's hands shook as she lifted them out, revealing a leather notebook underneath. The paper felt delicate, like autumn leaves ready to crumble. The notebook's pages were filled with her father's familiar handwriting, cramped and hurried, like he'd written everything in a rush. Charts, numbers, and cryptic notes covered every available space. Some entries were circled multiple times, others crossed out with heavy lines that had nearly torn through the paper. But it was what lay at the bottom of the box that made Claire's heart skip. A single key, its brass surface dulled with age, attached to a faded tag. She picked it up, squinting to read the faded text. Blue Ridge Storage, Unit 107. The key felt warm in her palm, as if it held all the answers she'd been searching for. Daniel leaned in closer, studying the key. Their eyes met, both understanding the weight of this discovery. Whatever Nathan Weston had been hiding all those years ago, whatever truth lay behind the missing money and the scandal that ruined him, the answers were waiting in that storage unit. The storm outside grew louder, as if nature itself was responding to the gravity of their find. The evening shadows stretched long across the Blue Ridge storage facility as Claire and Daniel's car pulled into the nearly empty lot. Row after row of metal storage units extended into the dimness like silent sentinels. Their headlights swept across the numbered doors until they spotted 107, tucked away in a back corner far from prying eyes. In the trailer behind them, Rusty shifted restlessly, his nervous snort cutting through the quiet air. Daniel stepped out first, his police instincts on high alert. His hand rested on his holstered weapon as he scanned the area. Something about the stillness made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Claire followed him down the narrow path between the units, their footsteps crunching on scattered gravel. The key from her father's lockbox felt heavy in her pocket, carrying the weight of 2 decades of secrets. When they reached Unit 107, Claire's hands trembled as she fitted the old key into the lock. The mechanism resisted at first, stiff from years of disuse, before finally giving way with a rusty groan. Daniel helped her roll up the door, the metal rattling loudly in the quiet evening. The musty smell of forgotten things washed over them. Dust motes danced in the beam of Daniel's flashlight, revealing stacks of wooden crates filled with old racing trophies, worn saddles, and faded photographs. A steel filing cabinet stood against one wall, its drawers slightly ajar. Claire's heart tightened. This wasn't just storage. This was her father's hidden sanctuary, his secret office where he'd kept all his mysteries. While Daniel began methodically searching through the filing cabinet, Claire's attention was drawn to a heavy wooden trunk pushed against the back wall. It looked out of place among the racing memorabilia, too new and too well maintained. She knelt beside it, running her fingers along the solid brass latches before working them open. The lid creaked as she lifted it, and she couldn't hold back her gasp. Stacked inside were neat bundles of cash, wrapped in faded rubber bands, the edges of the bills yellow with age. Her mind raced as she did a rough count. It had to be close to $500,000. The missing money from the Kentucky Derby scandal, the money her father had sworn he never took, the money that had destroyed his reputation and ultimately led to his death. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice shaking, "look at this." Before he could respond, the quiet was broken by the distinctive sound of an engine approaching. Through the open door, they watched a black SUV pull up at the facility entrance, its headlights cutting through the growing darkness. Claire and Daniel's eyes met in shared understanding. Someone had followed them here. Daniel quickly reached up and pulled the storage unit's light cord, plunging the space into darkness. Claire ducked behind a stack of wooden crates, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the partially open door, the SUV's headlights swept across the storage facility like searching eyes. The expensive vehicle came to a stop, its engine purring softly in the evening quiet. The driver's door opened with a solid thunk that seemed to echo through the still air. Claire peered between the crates, and her blood ran cold. Even after all these years, she'd recognized that commanding presence anywhere. Warren Price stepped out of the SUV, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the shabby surroundings. He moved with the confidence of someone used to getting his way, someone who had built an empire on others' broken dreams. Claire's mind flashed back to childhood memories, Price standing in their stables, arguing with her father, his voice carrying that same dangerous edge it had now. He'd been Nathan Weston's biggest rival in the racing world, always one step behind, until suddenly, mysteriously, he wasn't. Two men flanked Price as he strode toward their unit, their bulging jackets clearly concealing weapons. Price's polished shoes crunched on the gravel as he approached. "I know you're in there, Claire." His voice carried easily through the evening air. "You found the money, didn't you?" Daniel crouched beside Claire, his gun ready but held low. "What's his connection to this?" he whispered, eyes never leaving the approaching figures. Claire's throat felt dry as the pieces finally clicked into place. "My father always said Price was involved in the race-fixing scandal," she murmured back, her voice barely audible. "But he had no proof." Everything suddenly made terrible sense. Price hadn't just been involved, he'd been the mastermind. When Nathan Weston discovered the truth, Price had orchestrated his downfall, letting Claire's father take the blame for the missing money while he walked away clean. Now Price stood before their unit, his patience visibly wearing thin. He straightened his expensive suit jacket and gave a curt nod to his men. "Burn it down." One of the men reached into the SUV and pulled out a red gasoline canister, the liquid sloshing inside. Daniel's grip tightened on his weapon, his jaw set with determination. They had mere seconds to act. Flames erupted in an instant as the Molotov cocktail shattered against the concrete floor of the storage unit, sending glass shards skittering across the ground. The fire spread with frightening speed, climbing the metal walls and turning the enclosed space into an inferno. Thick, acrid smoke filled the air, making Claire's eyes water and her lungs burn as the temperature rose to unbearable levels. She doubled over, coughing violently, her throat raw from the toxic fumes. "Rusty," she choked out, knowing her horse would be terrified by both the flames and smoke. Her heart pounded with fear for him. Through the dense smoke, Daniel acted fast, his police training kicking in. He raised his gun and fired 2 quick shots into the air, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating his determined face. The sharp cracks echoed through the storage facility, sending Price's men diving for cover behind their black SUV. The momentary chaos was exactly what they needed to make their escape. Claire's mind raced even as her chest heaved for clean air, her lungs desperate for oxygen. She grabbed armfuls of files from the metal cabinet, clutching them tight against her chest as papers threatened to slip free. The evidence they needed was in these documents. She could feel it in her bones. This was their one chance to clear her father's name. "Move!" Daniel grabbed her arm, his grip firm but gentle, pulling her toward the exit. The heat was overwhelming now, like standing next to an open furnace, and the metal walls groaned from the intense temperature. Sweat poured down their faces as they stumbled out into the cool night air, gasping with relief. From his trailer, Rusty was wild-eyed and panicking, rearing up against his restraints and pawing at the air. The orange flames reflected in his dark eyes as he neighed in terror, his whole body trembling. Claire ran to him, fingers fumbling with the trailer's stubborn latch. Her hands were shaking from adrenaline, but she managed to free him just as the first gunshots rang out, bullets whizzing past them. Daniel jumped into the driver's seat, jamming the key into the ignition with practiced speed. The engine roared to life as bullets pinged off the car's metal frame, leaving small dents in their wake. Claire didn't hesitate. She grabbed Rusty's mane and swung onto his bare back in one fluid motion. The precious files still clutched tightly to her chest with her free arm. The car's tires squealed against the pavement as Daniel floored it, the engine growling in protest. Rusty needed no encouragement to follow, his powerful legs carrying him alongside the vehicle as naturally as if they'd practiced this escape 100 times. His hooves thundered against the asphalt as they fled into the night, leaving the burning storage unit and Warren Price's shocked men behind them. They'd escaped with their lives and the evidence, but now Price knew exactly what they had, and that made them more dangerous to him than ever before. The headlights of Daniel's patrol car cut through the darkness as they pulled up to the small hunting cabin. Hidden deep in the woods, the weathered structure blended perfectly with the surrounding forest. Rusty's hooves crunched on fallen leaves as Claire dismounted, her legs still shaking from their narrow escape. Daniel unlocked the cabin door, revealing a sparse but clean interior. A wooden table dominated the main room, while a small kitchenette and 2 cots occupied the corners. The familiar scent of pine and wood smoke lingered in the air. Claire set the rescued files on the table, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "My father wasn't the villain. He was trying to expose Price. That's why he took the money. He was keeping it out of Price's hands." Daniel nodded grimly as he secured the windows. "And now Price knows you're onto him." They spread the documents across the table's scarred surface, the yellow lamplight illuminating years of carefully gathered evidence. Claire's breath caught as she picked up a stack of bank statements. The transactions were clear, large sums moving through offshore accounts, all linked to Warren Price. "Look at this," she whispered, holding up a handwritten letter. The paper was worn at the creases, her father's familiar handwriting filling the page. It detailed everything: the threats, the pressure, the fear for his family's safety. Nathan Weston had discovered Price's operation and tried to stop it, only to be silenced. Daniel studied a set of blueprints, his expression darkening. "This is bigger than just stolen money. These are plans for an underground betting ring." He traced the detailed drawings with his finger. "Your father stumbled onto something massive. Price was fixing races across multiple tracks, probably for years." Claire sank into a chair, the weight of the truth settling over her. Her father hadn't been a thief or a criminal. He'd been a whistleblower, trying to expose corruption at the highest levels of horse racing, and he'd paid the ultimate price for his courage. The sudden flash of headlights through the trees made Claire's pulse spike. The beam swept across the cabin windows, illuminating the interior for a brief, terrifying moment. They'd been found. Daniel's hand moved to his gun, his expression hardening as he peered through the window. "Stay low," he whispered, positioning himself by the door. The headlights sliced through the darkness, their harsh beams cutting between the trees like searching fingers, casting eerie shadows that danced across the cabin walls. Rusty shifted uneasily outside the cabin, his hooves pawing at the ground as he sensed the approaching danger. His usual calm demeanor replaced by nervous energy. Inside, Daniel checked his ammunition with practiced efficiency, his movements precise and controlled, years of police training evident in every motion. His eyes locked onto Claire's, concern etched deeply in his features. "Stay low. If things go south, you take Rusty and ride. Don't stop. Don't look back." His voice was steady but urgent, carrying the weight of experience. Claire nodded, but there was steel in her expression, a determination born from years of injustice. She was done running. Warren Price had destroyed her father's life, torn apart their family, and she wouldn't let him walk away unscathed. Her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. The cabin door exploded inward with a thunderous crack, splintering wood flying in all directions. 3 men burst through, their weapons raised and ready, faces hard with purpose. Daniel moved like lightning, his police training taking over as muscle memory kicked in. He slammed into the first man, driving him to the floor and wrenching the gun from his grip with a swift, practiced motion. The sound of their struggle filled the small space, punctuated by grunts and the thud of bodies against wood. A gunshot cracked through the air, shattering a lamp and sending glass raining across the wooden floor like deadly crystal snow. Claire grabbed the stolen files, shoving them deep into her backpack with trembling but determined hands. If nothing else, these documents had to survive. They were her father's vindication, his truth, the key to clearing his name after all these years. Outside, Rusty's frightened whinny pierced the chaos, echoing through the trees. Something had spooked him badly, and Claire knew her faithful companion well enough to trust his instincts. Then, cutting through the mayhem, came the sound of slow, deliberate clapping, each strike of palm against palm like a countdown. The fighting stilled as Warren Price stepped into the cabin, his polished shoes crunching on broken glass. He looked completely unfazed by the violence, his expensive suit pristine, his smile cold and calculating, the picture of controlled malice. "You've given me quite the chase, Claire," he said, his voice smooth as silk but laced with venom, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. "But it ends tonight." His confidence filled the room like a toxic cloud. Daniel's gun swung toward Price, his aim steady and true, years of training evident in his unwavering grip. But Price merely raised his hand, that smirk still playing on his lips, as if he held all the cards in a game they didn't even know they were playing. "Go ahead, Officer Reed," he taunted, spreading his arms wide in mock invitation. "But killing me won't stop what's coming next." His eyes glittered with dark amusement. Claire felt her stomach drop at his words, ice spreading through her veins like frost on a window pane. The way he said it, so confident, so assured, there was something bigger at play here, something they hadn't uncovered yet. Her mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Price paced in front of the fireplace, with the smooth, predatory grace of a man who had spent decades getting away with his crimes. The flames cast dancing shadows across his expensive suit, making him look almost demonic in the flickering light. "Your father was an idiot, Claire," he said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone discussing the weather rather than a man's life. "He thought exposing me would clean up the sport. But no one wanted the truth. They wanted winners. And when he threatened to burn it all down, Well, he had to go. Claire's hands clenched into tight fists at her sides, her nails digging crescents into her palms. The rage she felt was white-hot, burning through her veins like liquid fire. "You framed him," she spat out, her voice trembling with fury. Price's smirk widened, satisfied at her reaction. "Of course. The money? That was just a tool to silence him." He shook his head, almost disappointed. "But your father, he was a stubborn man, and it seems his daughter inherited that trait." Daniel stepped forward, his police training evident in how he kept his gun steady despite the tension crackling through the air. "You killed Nathan Weston, didn't you?" His voice was hard, demanding truth where there had only been lies and shadows. Price exhaled slowly, like a teacher dealing with a particularly slow student. Then he nodded, the gesture deliberate and without a trace of remorse. "I made sure he never got a second chance." The confirmation hit Clare like a physical blow. Her father hadn't just been framed, he'd been murdered. All these years of wondering, of trying to piece together what had happened, and here stood the man responsible, admitting it without a shred of guilt. She took an instinctive step forward, fury overwhelming caution. But before she could move further, rough hands grabbed her from behind. One of Price's men yanked her back, pressing the cold barrel of a gun against her ribs. The metal bit through her shirt, a chilling reminder of just how dangerous their situation had become. Price turned to Daniel, his expression shifting to one of calculated business. "Here's how this ends, officer. You hand over the files, and I let the girl go." His voice hardened. "You try anything stupid, and I make sure no one ever finds her body." Daniel's grip tightened on his gun, his jaw clenched. He was outnumbered, surrounded by Price's men. But there was steel in his eyes, the look of a man who wasn't beaten yet. Outside the cabin, Rusty's hooves pounded against the earth, his snorts growing more agitated with each passing second. The horse's ears were pinned back, sensing Claire's fear and anger through the cabin walls. Daniel noticed the sound, his trained mind already calculating the possibilities. Price raised his hand, a silent signal to his gunman. But before the man could squeeze the trigger, Daniel launched himself sideways, sending a wooden chair clattering across the floor. The sudden movement startled Price's men. Their attention split for a crucial moment. Clare seized her chance. She drove her elbow hard into her captor's ribs, feeling the satisfying crunch of impact. The man's grip loosened just enough for her to twist free, her heart pounding in her chest. Then came the explosion of splintering wood. The cabin door burst inward with a thunderous crash as Rusty's massive form filled the doorway. The horse's eyes were wild, nostrils flaring as he charged straight into Price's men. His powerful body slammed into them like a freight train, sending one man flying backward into the table. Papers scattered through the air like confetti as the table collapsed. Price stumbled backward, his usual composure shattered. His hand fumbled for the gun at his waist, but Daniel was faster. His fist connected with Price's jaw in a brutal arc, the impact throwing the businessman to the floor. Clare grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace, its weight solid and reassuring in her hands. As Price's second man raised his weapon, she swung with all her might. The poker connected with his wrist with a sharp crack, and his gun clattered to the wooden floor. Daniel pressed his advantage, dropping onto Price before the man could recover. He pressed his service weapon against Price's temple, the barrel digging into the skin. "It's over," Daniel growled. For the first time since this nightmare began, Price's arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by something Clare had waited 20 years to see: fear. The wail of approaching police sirens cut through the chaos, growing louder with each second. Help had finally arrived. The red and blue lights of police cruisers painted the forest in alternating colors as Clare stood outside the cabin, watching officers load Price and his men into the waiting vehicles. Her father's murderer was finally going to face justice. The weight of 2 decades pressed against her chest as she watched Price's head disappear into the back of a squad car. Daniel approached, his steps crunching on the fallen leaves. His face showed a mixture of satisfaction and gentle concern as he stopped beside her. "They'll be behind bars for a long time," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "And with the evidence you saved, their entire operation is going down." Clare nodded, but the victory felt bittersweet. Her father had died trying to expose this corruption. He never got to see this moment, never got to clear his name. Detective Holt's car pulled up, and the seasoned investigator made her way over to Clare. Her eyes were kind as she drew Clare aside, away from the bustle of the arrest scene. "Your father wasn't a thief, Clare," Holt said softly, placing a gentle hand on Clare's shoulder. "He was a whistleblower, and you just finished what he started." The words hit Clare like a wave, and tears welled up in her eyes. But for the first time since this whole nightmare began, they weren't tears of pain or fear. They were tears of relief, of vindication. Rusty approached from where he'd been waiting patiently, his hooves silent on the soft earth. He nudged Clare's shoulder with his velvet nose, seeming to sense the change in her emotions. Clare turned to him, a smile breaking through her tears as she ran her fingers through his coarse mane. "He never left my side," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not once." The first rays of sunlight began to peek through the trees, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds. Clare took a deep breath and pulled herself onto Rusty's broad back, settling into the familiar comfort of his warmth. Daniel watched her mount up, his hands in his pockets. "Where are you headed?" he asked. Clare looked out over the rolling hills, breathing in the crisp morning air. The world felt different somehow, lighter. "Home," she answered simply. Then she and Rusty rode away, leaving behind the darkness that had haunted them for so long. 2 months later, Clare stood outside the imposing courthouse steps, her hands smoothing down her dark blue dress. The morning sun caught the brass handles of the heavy wooden doors, making them gleam. Around her, reporters gathered with their cameras and microphones, but she barely noticed them. Her mind was focused on what lay ahead, the trial that would finally bring Warren Price to justice. Daniel appeared beside her, adjusting his navy tie with steady hands. His presence had become a constant comfort over these past months, unwavering and solid. "Ready?" he asked quietly, his eyes meeting hers with understanding. Clare inhaled deeply, drawing strength from the crisp autumn air. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about her father, about setting the record straight after 20 years of lies. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution methodically laid out their case. Evidence recovered from the storage unit fire was displayed on large screens, damning bank statements showing illegal transfers, detailed records of fixed races, and her father's heartfelt letters warning of the corruption he'd discovered. The courtroom fell silent as Price's former associate, James Murphy, took the stand. His testimony revealed the intricate web of manipulation that had controlled the racing world for decades. He described how Price had systematically threatened, bribed, and eliminated anyone who stood in his way. When it was Clare's turn to testify, her voice remained steady as she recounted her father's final days. She told them about his desperate warnings, the threatening phone calls that came in the middle of the night, and how Price had meticulously constructed the theft allegations that destroyed Nathan Weston's reputation. "My father knew the truth would come out someday," she said, her gaze fixed on Price. "He died protecting that truth." Price sat at the defense table, his expensive suit no longer projecting the power it once did. His trademark smirk had vanished, replaced by a tightness around his eyes as his empire crumbled around him. The jury took less than 6 hours to reach their decision. As the judge called for order, Clare's heart pounded against her ribs. The forewoman stood, paper trembling slightly in her hands. On all counts, we find the defendant, Warren Price, guilty. Clare closed her eyes, feeling 20 years of weight lift from her shoulders in a single breath. Tears slipped down her cheeks as the judge continued reading the verdicts for each charge. Her father's name was finally officially cleared. The autumn breeze rustled through the tall grass as Clare stood in the center of her father's old ranch, watching the renovation crew work on the weathered buildings. The familiar scent of sawdust and fresh paint filled the air as workers replaced rotting boards and reinforced old support beams. Rusty stood faithfully beside her, his tail swishing contentedly as he observed the activity. The old stables, once worn and neglected, were slowly coming back to life. New windows gleamed in the afternoon sun, and fresh red paint brightened the faded walls. The sound of hammers and power tools created a rhythm of renewal that made Clare's heart swell with purpose. "Looks like you're finally putting down roots," a familiar voice called out. Clare turned to find Daniel leaning against the white fence, his police uniform exchanged for casual jeans and a flannel shirt. His eyes crinkled with warmth as he watched her. "I think it's time," Clare replied, running her hand along Rusty's strong neck. "My father spent his life making sure these horses had a future. I want to do the same." She walked over to join Daniel at the fence, explaining how the stolen money had been returned to the racing organizations. Her voice grew animated as she shared her vision of transforming the ranch into a sanctuary for retired racehorses, a peaceful haven where they could live out their days in comfort and dignity. Daniel listened intently, a knowing smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "So does this mean you're officially staying?" Clare paused, taking in the sprawling landscape before her. The setting sun painted the fields in warm golden light, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called out. This land held both painful memories and endless possibility. She thought about how far she'd come, about the truth she'd uncovered, and about the future she could build here. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think I am." Rusty stepped forward and nudged Clare playfully with his nose before turning and galloping toward the open pasture, his mane catching the last rays of sunlight. For the first time in years, Clare felt the same sense of freedom as she watched him run, unburdened, unafraid, and finally home. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the freshly painted buildings of Weston Ranch as dozens of people gathered for the grand reopening. The once neglected property now gleamed with new life. Pristine white fences lined the pastures, flower beds burst with fall colors, and the restored barn stood proud against the clear blue sky. Clare watched as familiar faces from the racing world mingled in the courtyard. Former jockeys swapped stories with veteran trainers, while journalists scribbled notes about the ranch's transformation into a sanctuary for retired racehorses. The air buzzed with conversation and laughter, punctuated by the occasional gentle neighing from the stables. Near the entrance, a covered plaque waited to be unveiled. Clare's heart quickened as she approached it, surrounded by the crowd. With steady hands, she pulled away the cloth, revealing the polished bronze beneath. Nathan Weston, a true horseman, a true champion. Her fingers traced the letters of her father's name, feeling the cool metal beneath her touch. A lump formed in her throat as she remembered all it had taken to reach this moment. The truth finally revealed, justice served, and his legacy restored. Around her, the ranch hummed with activity. In the training ring, a young girl took her first riding lesson, her face bright with excitement as she learned to properly hold the reins. In the far pasture, retired racehorses grazed peacefully, their racing days behind them, but their dignity intact. Daniel, now a permanent fixture in the county police force, stood beside Clare, watching the scene unfold. His presence had become a constant comfort in her life, steady and unwavering. "So what's next?" he asked, turning to face her. Clare smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I don't know," she admitted. "But for the first time, that doesn't scare me." Rusty appeared beside them, his coat gleaming in the sunlight. Clare reached out to stroke his familiar mane, her fingers running through the silky strands. "Let's ride, boy," she whispered. With practiced ease, she swung onto his back. Together, they took off across the open fields, hooves thundering against the earth. This time, there was no fear driving them forward, no desperate message to deliver, just the pure, simple joy of running free. The morning mist clung to the grass as Clare made her way through the quiet cemetery, her footsteps soft against the dewy ground. Rusty followed a few paces behind, his hooves leaving gentle impressions in the earth as he grazed on patches of clover. The headstone stood beneath an old oak tree, its marble surface clean and well-maintained. Nathan Weston's name was etched deeply into the stone, along with the dates that marked his too short life. Clare knelt before it, her fingers tracing the familiar letters. From her jacket pocket, she withdrew a gleaming racing medal, one of the few pieces of evidence that had survived the fire at the storage unit. Its bronze surface caught the early morning light, still bright despite the years that had passed. With gentle reverence, she placed it against the cool marble. "You were right, Dad," she whispered, her voice carried by the gentle breeze. "The truth mattered, and I made sure they knew it." Near the cemetery entrance, Daniel waited by his car, giving Clare the space she needed for this moment. His steady presence provided comfort from afar, just as it had throughout their journey to justice. Clare closed her eyes, feeling the wind as it rushed through the trees above. The leaves rustled a peaceful melody, so different from the storms that had raged in her heart for so many years. She had carried the weight of her father's tarnished name like a heavy chain, never quite sure if she would find the key to unlock it. But now, sitting before his grave, with his name finally cleared, Clare felt that burden lift. The peace she had searched for had finally found its way home. Rising slowly, she brushed the grass from her jeans and walked back to where Rusty waited. The horse lowered his head as she approached, allowing her to run her fingers through his mane. With practiced ease, she swung onto his back, taking one last look at the rolling hills that stretched out before them. "Come on, boy," she said softly. "Let's go home." The rising sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, its warm light washing over them as Clare and Rusty began their journey back to the ranch. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel and Rusty, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.